We are live.
We're live. Okay. Oh, there. That's what it says. Well, hello. Hi everyone. And this is Deboki. I'm from Okie Dokie Boki, the channel that you're watching this on, and I'm here with Nicole Sweeney from over at Nicole Sweeney, and we are here with month 2 of our nonfiction book club discussion. Yay. So if you guys are returning, that's awesome. Thank you. And if this is your first time joining in, basically the story is that Nicole and I decided to do a nonfiction book club a little bit of a while ago. And then we decided that we needed to do it more urgently in more recent months. And so what we're going to do is basically go back and forth. So like this month will be on my channel. We're going to talk about more of like a hard sciencey book. And next month we will be on Nicole's channel. And we're going to be talking more like the social sciencey, sociology-ish kind of book.
I think today's conversation is going to show us the limits of that.
Exactly. It's a blend today, which I'm starting to feel might end up becoming a theme on depending on the books we go into. So we're gonna talk about what book we're gonna be doing next month at the end of this. But so for now. Yeah, we're gonna start by talking about the book we want to talk about today, which is Superior by Angela Saini. Sorry, is something echoey?
No, that was me. That was my fault. I apologize. I did it.
Awesome. So also this is a live stream, so there's like a chat, so you can like join in on the chat as we go along. And then also towards the end, like around like after like 40-ish minutes, we're gonna like start like kind of like doing our concluding thoughts. So like if we'll say at that point, like if there's additional discussion-y, question-y type things you have, to put them in the chat. So save like big questions that you want to have like for the end as well. But for today, we're talking about Superior, The Return of Race Science by Angela Saini. So just to give the quick summary of what the book is, over the course of Superior, Saini is basically tracking our concept of race as a scientific thing, like as like a biological thing, basically like how scientists and other parties have attempted to codify race and racism into biology, and basically how these attempts are ultimately doomed because the science is not always the way that people, especially racists, seem to want it to go. So like the most vivid examples throughout this book are things like eugenics and nationalism, which I think a lot of us are very familiar with. And so she goes into a lot of the scientific and medical work that like went into that, but also she gets into work that, you know, might seem more well-intentioned, but that still reveal like how flawed and prevalent our belief of race as a biological category is, and how that ultimately still drives bad things, like no matter how good those intentions are. So it's a lot. It's 200 pages, and she manages to explore a lot. So we figured that to just start off, a lot of this book is based on genetics, because a lot of it is based on how we've attempted to use genetics, or scientists have attempted to use genetics to explain what we see of as race. And this is going to be a very broad introduction, but I thought it would be interesting to go over it because genetics is one of those things that seems like super simple at first, like you inherit genes from your parents, and then like you become a person, and that's informed by what your genes are. But the thing with like genetics is that basically like the way I feel like it works is that your cells are playing like the longest game of telephone ever with like multiple people on the line, because it's informed by like all of the people that you are like descended from, and it's complicated by things like mutations, and the way you interpret that message, your cells interpret that message, is complicated by a lot of things. And we've like, obviously people have known about heredity for a super long time, like for ages. It's informed a lot about the way the world works. But we really didn't like figure out that genetics was a thing until like the past 2 centuries. The Mendel and his famous pea experiments from the mid-19th century happened. And that was actually super underappreciated at the time. It wasn't until like the 1900s when like evolution was starting to gain traction, and people were like, maybe there's a thing called a gene. Maybe there are mutations. Maybe that explains how evolution happens. Like all of these things started to come together, and people rediscovered his work. And I think one of the really wild things is when you learn about genetics, or like the history of genetics, is how much people were piecing this stuff together without actually knowing that DNA even existed. Like they were like talking about heredity. They were talking about like how there's these packages of information, but they didn't know what those packages were. And it wasn't until like mid-ish 20th century that we actually learned that DNA was even a thing. But then learning what DNA is and how to work with it led to like a lot of different molecular techniques that let us sequence DNA, that led to big things like the Human Genome Project. But most importantly, the technology to study DNA and understand and sequence it has gotten super cheap. And so that's led to things like consumer DNA testing, like 23andMe. And so this is all like super important to how we understand biology. It's really like being able to study DNA at this like sequence level, like being able to actually read how DNA works and how it's changed across organisms is part of how we understand evolution. Before, when we were trying to categorize organisms, we just looked at them. We were like, this thing kind of looks like this thing, and so maybe they're related. And then we looked in their DNA and we realized like, no, they're actually like I'm obsessed with amoeba. And like one of the things we realized with amoeba is that like, even though they all kind of look just like blobs, or a lot of them look like blobs, they're actually very different, or like they all just came across their blob lifestyle at like separate points in evolutionary history. And so the point of all this is that we've learned to compare sequences of DNA, and that's like helped us understand how traits have been handed down and stuff. And it's like really changed the way that we approach categorizing things. And so it's changed the way we approach categorizing organisms, but it also affects the way that we try to categorize humans. And this is all of this is to say is like none of this actually matters. Like I gave this broad overview of genetics and it is important, but it also doesn't matter when it comes, not to say it doesn't matter, but especially with the particular focus of this book, which is race, the biology falls apart.
Yes. The basic point of this book is this is the science that people are trying to base their ideas in, but it turns out doesn't really line up in the way that they want it to.
Turns out it's hard. And it's hard to make science say what you want it to say. Thank you for letting me.
That's it. That's the live stream. See you all next month.
Yeah. We've done it. We've talked about the book.
Yeah.
So yeah, one of the things that I think is super interesting about this book actually comes at the end when Angela Saini says, basically, we're trying to understand with science what we would better understand with history. Mm-hmm. And so maybe it's weird to start the discussion with how it ends, but I think one of the important themes running through this book is like scientists are people, like however objective they think they are, that forms the way that they do the science.
Yeah, I mean, like obviously it is an important. She has that like the big sort of sweeping statement at the end, but she's building that case throughout the entire book. So like it doesn't really feel like beginning at the end. I think to start there because I noticed it pretty much early on. Like that was a thing that I started highlighting as points where she was like places in the book where she's pointing out, like this is an example of somebody. Like asking a question based on their like social and political context, like even with the most generous interpretation of their intentions, this is still a human being making choices about what kinds of questions that they are going to ask, and like the way that they are framing those questions in their minds, however neutral they think they are being in their approach to the question or the data, like that question is still going to be informed by social context. And I think like that is pervasive throughout the book. And it comes up a couple times too in terms of like the ways in which the same data is being interpreted by different groups of people too. Yeah. I think is really interesting, and that is still ultimately being fed back through the loop of like social and political context in ways that I think is really, really interesting, in part because the questions that people are trying to the things that people are trying to explain are actually really explained by social and political context. Yeah. But they're like trying to go at this, like come at it from the like biology, genetic sort of approach. And it is their like social and political context that makes them want to approach it that way. I don't know if I'm like explaining that correctly, but that was interesting to see them up over and over.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Because like when you're assigned, like if you're trained in a particular mode of science, like you think like that, like you can use that to understand things, and particularly something like genetics. Like we like found that like DNA codes the way that like our bodies work, and so like we want to treat everything like as if it's based on DNA, and especially like there's one point where they're talking about she's talking about how one of the problems that happens is like our problems in biology have gotten so small that we can solve, like, because the big discoveries have already been taken. And so like if you're already limited in what your toolkit is and you're limited in what your like questions are, like that combination, like you have to be really aware of like those limitations compound, right? Like in a really big way. And it's so easy to get narrow with your focus, especially like there's like a way of privileging like STEM thinking, I guess, that like I think this book is basically about like why that is going to lead you astray.
Yeah, there's a thing, it's like one of the, I'm trying to remember what specifically it was, because it jumped out at me, but people trying to like privilege that the privileging of STEM thinking. There's a bit where she notes scientists. This is going to be like a really vague summary because I'm forgetting the specific context that it comes up in the book under, but like notes that scientists seem to like keep seeing the ways in which social context is affecting these things, but still like trying to like attach it to that in this way that for me as a somebody who majored in sociology, I'm like, I know why. It's because they like look down on social science and they're like, no, there's got to be a STEM answer to this.
Yeah.
No, bitch. It's social context, socialization. It's like access to resources. It's all of these things that like that are fuzzy and like that you can't pin down in quite the same like neat kinds of ways. And like I'm sorry, but that's just people. That's how people are. You have to accept it.
Yeah, I think I always feel like there's a lot of this book where I feel kind of like not attacked because I feel like I've generally been like, I try to be conscious of this kind of stuff. So like, especially like my background was with genetic engineering, and with genetic engineering, the thing you like learn very quickly is that it never comes down to just like the one gene. Like you put a gene in another organism and suddenly it does things completely differently. The whole point is like, nothing works the way that you think it works, because like she says, like one of the scientists she interviews is like, biology is a system. And that is like such a like, it's the thing people know, and yet like it's so hard to like grasp how complicated that makes things that you just like want to be like, no, I gotta solve this one thing. And
I just need to isolate the one thing, and so then I just need to monitor this one set of inputs and outputs, and like that's it. It's just the one.
Yeah, and it's wild too, because in some ways it feels like society feels like it should be more complicated, but in some ways it seems like with sociology, not that they've necessarily found simple answers, but they have been able to isolate more effectively like single things that can affect your outcomes, like compared to like a gene. But maybe not. You can tell me if I'm wrong.
Go
for it. I don't know.
I think that it is still fairly complicated. I think that like it's more that like there's a greater willingness to acknowledge like social, because it's there's sort of she talks about this also later in the book, like the way in which scientists are asking questions that assume a premise, and like that the reader has to assume a premise that like actually is bullshit in order to follow you down the line of the question. I think he's talking about the blogger who was the thing about like African American women being less attractive or whatever, like that like, and he starts, in order to like follow the rest of his thinking, you have to like accept some like bullshit premises at the start. And so kind of flip side of that, I think that in sociology, there's just like you are starting from the premise of like social systems matter in a way that I think maybe the coming from here, that can feel like wild, but I think it still comes back to the same thing of not, it's not that the inputs and outputs have really like clean and simple correlation, more that like there's just an understanding that you're never going to get that one-to-one, like that, like single input equals single output, that sort of baseline. So you're always working towards something less concrete. You're working towards something less like if X then Y. You're looking towards like if generally X then generally Y. And so if we're currently doing A and we're getting B, and what we really want to get is Y, and like X will get us more of Y, then like that's fine, as opposed to the clear cut sort of way of thinking of it. I think it's like a larger way of thinking that is different. Not that the answers are necessarily cleaner and more straightforward.
Yeah. It also might just be that the answers were not in the genes. So
yes.
Of course, like if that's going to be the problem, like then you're not going to get the clean answer. Yeah. And I think like one of the things that I liked too, like, so Saini like weaves in a lot of her own kind of like personal experience. Like she talks about like growing up in the UK as like a brown person. Like she talks about like her experiences working in India. She talks about she has like one chapter that like starts with like an anecdote about like It's a Small World. And I thought that was like kind of a smart choice in relation to that, because in some ways she's like preempting any like criticism of her own bias. Like I think in some ways she's sort of saying like, like these scientists are biased and like I have a clear perspective that's informing the way that I connect to what I am myself talking about. And I don't think it diminishes the points she makes. I think it like it works in really well to like tie these things together.
Yeah. Well, and it enhances it. If part of the point that you are going to make is that like people are bringing their own history and like bias, baggage, what have you, whatever words you want to use for that phenomenon. In order to make that point, you do have to foreground with like, here's what I am also bringing. Like here's what I bring to that conversation. And like, I think that it definitely enhanced the entire experience that she like wove that stuff in really, really effectively.
Yeah.
In addition, also just like while we're talking about like the things about the way the book was written, something that we talked about before we started recording, this isn't really like a larger discussion topic, but something that is just worth noting about like the book itself, is how well structured it is and like clearly structured it is. Like Devoki was saying before we started recording that she had a point where she was like taking notes about, oh, this chapter is about this, and then she looked back and the heading was like she said it. She said what it's about.
Yeah. I thought I was smarter than Angela Saini, and I was wrong. Which is like what I should have expected. I thought I had like really tricked her and like figured out like a deeper meaning to the chapter, and it's like it's really good. Like I was reviewing for this, and I was like, I can just like kind of like go chapter by chapter and like see what it's about. And I think it's like really effective at like conveying a large amount of information. Like she's covering so many different fields and like, and particularly in such a contentious topic. And I think the way that she like lays it out, like I'm kind of in awe of, where like it's 200 pages, like each chapter is a relatively fast read, like where you kind of get like a full story within each chapter. And each one of those chapters probably could be like a book on its own, right? Like that chapter on migration, like Jocelyn was talking about the migratory patterns. Like I feel like that is like a thing that could be its own book, and like she still managed to convey like what the point of it is, like relevant to the actual subject of this book, like work through it really quickly.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, which makes sense for the survey kind of thing that this is. There's sort of an invitation that like if you get to the end of a chapter and like you're like, this is the thing that I find particularly fascinating, whether it be migratory patterns, whatever it is, like it's like any one of these chapters, there exist like many whole books that are just about like what the chapter is about. But she did yes, just to like reiterate the point that you just made, it does a good job of still summarizing all of that without feeling like, oh no, you didn't. I know that there is more if I want to like look further into this, but I got enough from this chapter. I got enough of that overview that I can move on to like the next sort of overview that you want about this topic.
Like I was also thinking about this book in relation to our last book that we did, The Personality Brokers, and like that obsession with classification, and kind of like the differences. I mean, there's similarities and like they're both permeated by racism, but like there's
fascism, a lot of racism and fascism back
weirdly, we did not deliberately like plan out to like
not intend for this to be the nonfiction fascism.
But like I guess that is where we are in the world, is like documenting the past, like to learn lessons, hopefully. And I think like I don't know where I'm going with this. I just it's there's something about that, like that love of categorization and how dark, like how quickly it can get so dark, especially like related to that reliance on science, like that insistence on science, and then being able to twist the language of science. That is like very uncomfortable. I was telling you like a few days ago, like I was like doing research for like an episode of Journey to the Microcosmos, and it's like an episode about how microbes make decisions, which does not seem like it should relate to this conversation at all. But I was like learning about, like, I love whenever I'm doing like microcosmos stuff, I love learning about the history of the experiments. And I started learning about this guy who did experiments with paramecium. They're just like another blobby microbe. And he was doing behavioral experiments. And like, I quickly looked him up on Wikipedia to see what he's about. And it said like, he wrote about eugenics. And I was like, oh shit, I don't know if he's going to make it into the episode. And then I had to do like a whole deep dive to like figure out like, okay, so he apparently like, he probably thought that race was like a real thing. But the goal of his experiments is he became like, I think he was in the Eugenics Society, but then left it. And it was in part because he like started thinking about how the environment played into like the way that genetics like manifests. And so part of the reason why he was doing all these experiments with paramecium was to like prove that we make decisions that are not just about like our genes, like that, like our environment makes a big difference. And like, I was like, this is like, I get the connection to the eugenics, but like, this is like not where I thought we were going to go. Like science. Like, how do we like, yeah. There's just so much like that. I feel like I'm still kind of like processing about the weird ways that like it's so familiar, like the weird ways that we use science to justify like really bad things. But I think a lot of this book was about just like how science, especially like as a structure, contributes to it.
Yes. Yeah. That there's a pathway. This is actually something that I think that this is maybe one of the few places that I would have liked her to go a little bit further, because again, it's like near the end of the book that she does start talking about this idea of like people introducing a premise and then like following that logic through, but if like the premise is crap, then like it doesn't really matter that I followed the rest of your logic, because like the premise was absurd. And I think that structure, it's one of those things that this is permeating the book, but I would have liked it to be like more and more explicit of like, this is the problem, is that like people are building, you know, their those foundational ideas, again, in their very specific social and political context. Like that is informing the ideas, the questions that they are asking, the assumptions that they are starting with. Like however much they're trying to get out of it, they are still starting with a certain number of assumptions that are very much culturally grounded and informed and whatever. And like, I think that this is true very much across the board, that like that is always going to be, there is no way to get out of that, like really truly get out of or around the fact that you are still a person who is asking a question, and like you don't know what it is that you don't know, like you don't know what ways in which like your cultural context is obfuscating like the problems with the questions that you're asking. And like it's and again, this is all like with the most generous possible interpretation of intentions, because sometimes the intentions are just bad. But like even
I think it's hard too, because like there are like I mentioned, like there's like the well-meaning researchers too who like are not trying to like be racist, but like also fundamentally like haven't taken that like, and like I would include myself in this. Like I think like a lot of the stuff in this book like was new for me too, in terms of how she explained it scientifically. But she's like talking about these researchers who are like answering questions like that are like including race, like asking people what their race is, and like she's like asking them like, what is race? And like they don't have a definition. It's just so ingrained in the system where like you don't, like again, like that idea of like you don't know what you don't know, but like also everyone around you like thinks that this is real. And like we like obviously race is a real thing socially, and it's hard to explain or hard to fully grasp what it means to not have it being real biologically, when like we do know that like, you know, that there are certain genes that are like more specific to like some groups than in others. Like we know that there's genetic variation, we know that there are differences, we can see differences in like how we look, but like those are not the key. Like understanding that like there are differences, but that race, it's still not like, as we often think about it, is not a real thing. Like there's a real, like even like I remember when I was first like hearing her talk about this book at a conference, like I was like, part of me gets this and part of me is having a hard time reconciling this with like the assumptions that I have about things, which are really very much driven by like how I like have learned about things, right? And so this book for me was really helpful for piecing it all together and like understanding what it is she's saying. But I think it's tough. It's tough to say that like there are groups, but groups are also overlapping. Like that, like, or like, what does that mean?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think also just like more broadly, this is the thing that like something being a social construct doesn't mean it's not real. Like there is like a social reality, and like we are social beings living in a social world, and so like things that we are socially constructing are still like real in the world in some kind of way. And like and part of the point of noting that something is a social construct isn't to say this thing isn't real. It's more to say like we can change, we as a group, not an individual, but like collectively we can change that social reality, and like that it is incumbent upon us to do that, to like ask ourselves, what are the things that we are socially constructing? How are the things that we are socially constructing affecting us? And like what, like, are these things serving us? Should we be deconstructing these things? Like, and so on and so forth. And I think that this book does a really, really good job of breaking that down and breaking down like science. A lot of people were doing a lot of really, really bad science, but then it was having like real consequences in the world. And like those real consequences in the world don't mean that the things that the scientists wanted to believe were true, but they also don't mean like that fact doesn't necessarily mean that like the consequences aren't real either. You know, like it's she did a very, very good job of explaining that, I think.
Yeah. I think like the sickle cell anemia, like actually like that last chapter, the medical chapter, was like super interesting too, because like that's like I feel like a context where like you learn like, okay, like our medical trials were not diverse enough. It's because we need to take into account race. But like really what we need to take into account are like other things that we have just overshadowed with race. Like there are other things that like we've mapped onto race instead of like fully like delving into what those factors are that might be affecting our clinical trials. Or like the way that we're giving drugs or like assigning drugs, or the way that we understand sickle cell anemia. Like, yeah, like it's the idea of like when we use race in a scientific context, like it's the way that I've heard her describe it as like as a proxy for something else. Like it's always a proxy for something else, because like at a biological level, it like doesn't mean the thing that we often say it does.
Yes, this Jocelyn just shared the American habit, the quote from the end: "The American habit of collecting data by race has the unintended consequence of driving researchers to use it, hunting for gaps, and trying any means possible to explain those gaps." And like that's basically the summary of the whole book. All right, like that's like that is the essential point of the whole thing. Also, something that you said earlier too about the way in which other scientists like being surrounded by people who are also sort of thinking this way and approaching this way, and that sort of like feedback like cycle or whatever. It made me think of something else that Jocelyn said too. Anytime she mentioned that group of men who kept citing each other, like any of them were credible. The whole like the Mankind Quarterly stuff specifically. So this is, if you did not read the book, there is a thing called the Mankind Quarterly, which is basically it's like a big like racist journal funded mostly by Pioneer Foundation, I think. Yes.
Pioneer Fund. Yeah.
I don't know. There were a handful of like conservative like eugenicist movements that have funded this thing, but I think that's was the main one. But it's basically like Mankind Quarterly is essentially a way for people with like really who want to do like really racist science to publish that really racist science. And like it kind of goes back to the institutions of science that Deboki was talking about the ways in which it's like you have a journal article that is published that says this thing, and then like what does that mean? Like there's there's sort of a separate like a media literacy thread to all of this, I think, that I think it's not something that she goes on about at length, but I think I would be curious to see how you would incorporate some of the lessons of this book into like a scientific media literacy like class, to say like, okay, so this was cited in a journal article, but like who is funding this journal article? Like these are sort of the basic tenets of media literacy, right? Like who is the source, like who, how was this funded, why are they doing, et cetera, and like the tracing the linkages, tracing the ties between the Mankind Quarterly and then like, but people who have actual more credible institutional ties, that stuff I thought was really, really interesting too. That's another thing that I feel like I would love to read a whole book on,
the whole network,
on blood style book on
it's like a whole network, and it's so like that chapter that was about like human biodiversity and how that has like become a thing that like people how people like have substituted biodiversity for a lot of their racist rhetoric, where it sounds like it's a nice thing, but like actually they're using it to like further their own agenda, and like how easy it is to hide this stuff. Because like there's that guy who like got dragged into it and then was like, oh shit, like I don't want to be on this message thread. Like this is not where I want to be. Like it's so easy to.
Who among us hasn't found themselves in a chat and you were like, oh no,
not here. Yeah. Yeah, I think like yeah, just remembering like the surprise of like these people. Another thing I was going to say, like related, like that. It's so easy to cite things if it shows up in a journal without actually looking into like what that journal is. And like you see that all the time, like in skincare subreddits, for example, people will like prove their point by just doing like a quick PubMed search, and they'll like get the abstract and like that's it. And it's like that's not it. Like you gotta like dive into a paper, and like that's what happened with the paper that was published in Science, which is like the top journal, like one of like the 3 top journals if you're in science, like that if you get in there you like feel super good. But he got his paper in there and then everyone was like reading it and they're like, this is not good. Like is Bruce Lawn, the one who said he found like the genes that explain brain size, which was connected to the advent of civilization rising, and people were like like, but you got to dive into the paper to see that. So yeah, I feel like that media literacy, especially right now, I don't want to derail this, but like, I will say that like science literacy or science media literacy, like I don't think everyone should have to know everything in science. Like everyone's got their own thing to do. But especially like journalists and scientists, I think like understanding how to dissect that it has consequences.
Speaking of Bruce Lawn, something else that I really enjoyed about this book is you can definitely feel the like, I don't know, the journalism like background in the way in which Saini like paints just like really colorful characters out of various people. Like there's a lot of people over the course of this book. So it's not really dwelling on any individual for the length of time that like the personality brokers, obviously, like it was all about Isabel and Catherine. Whereas, there are a ton of characters, but like a lot of them are introduced in ways that I'm like, yeah, like Bruce Lawn sounds like a character.
yeah. Like especially like because it was like a New Yorker article too, which like Reminder, a New Yorker article is what eventually led to Elizabeth Holmes's downfall, because John Carreyrou read it and was like, something's not right here. So, get your science personality coverage from the New Yorker, apparently.
Miriam says, because the only thing I know about is climate, I was reminded of papers published on fossil fuels / climate, and that were designed not to move science, but to give ExxonMobil and others social license to operate, which yes.
Yeah. Like, and that's related to that clinical trial at the end she talks about like this clinical trial that basically this company did. They wanted to like get a patent or something, but they didn't have much time. They couldn't get the approval to do a full trial. So they basically were like, we're going to only test this in African Americans, and that's it. Like, and then we're going to get it approved for that group only. And then it basically was known as the black pill, because like that's what it was prescribed for, even though the doctors involved were like, it works for everyone. Like I give it to white people all the time.
How much do you, that's a really good question. How much do barriers to accessing full papers and lower scientific paper literacy, I was better at reading papers critically in school than I am now, contribute to citing abstracts without critique? And like, I mean, yes, a lot. I guess it's probably the answer to that question.
Yeah, open access is, I believe, the way that science should be done. For many reasons, I think it's better for science. I think it's better for the public. But I think there's also a lot of other factors. There's a lot of issues with journals. There are predatory journals. There's issues in the way that publishing is structured. So I think like one of the sad lessons from this book is that it doesn't matter how maligned a journal is. Like the Mankind Quarterly is not like a successful journal. Like nobody in academia really, like outside of the people who publish in it, like necessarily treat it as like a legit journal, but that doesn't stop it from having impact and doesn't stop it from connecting to people who want that content, basically.
Yeah, it is like, there is a weird tension, I think, between the sense of like wanting things to be more open, because of the ways in which like that is like better for the public, but also an awareness in situations like that of like, okay, but people who are not actively like trained to read and understand this stuff well are out there using it towards like shitty ends, and so this is I think this is like across academic disciplines. This is sort of like a problem when you you do again, like not wanting to gatekeep it, like wanting to make like this knowledge as open and as accessible as possible, but also like how do you do that in a way that isn't also how do you do that responsibly? Like how do you do that in a way that says like, okay, here's how to like understand what you're looking at, and not just like opening the door so that you can just like, yes, I'm a racist and I want to find a journal article that like espouses my views, and here's the Mankind Quarterly, and whatever.
Yeah, that's like Jocelyn's comment, like doesn't stop people like co-opting new language to dress up their prejudices. Like there's the one where she talks about how like people have moved from calling themselves, people aren't calling themselves racists, but like they're calling themselves race realists, right? Like where they're like saying, well, like, don't you think race is a real thing? And like in a way it's like, well, how do you argue with that? Like I think race is a thing. I don't think it's a thing the way that you think it's a thing. Like that kind of.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. A lot of these like branding questions. This struck me a number of times, but like, and I think that this is something that we're going to see broadly in a lot of the things that we talk about over the course of doing this project. Because certainly it was a big thing in the personality brokers too, like the way in which you are. There's like a separate branding question around the ideas that you're trying to advance. And one of the scientists that Saini talked to, but he like was surprised at the professionalism of the various organizations that were supporting and like adjacent to Mankind Quarterly. And I think like this makes me think something that, in both of us in like sort of psychom spaces, like working on YouTube and whatnot, you see this now with stuff like PragerU, that like the part of how they sell their bullshit is by like co-opting the visual, like the aesthetic of this is what like other well-researched educational YouTube channels, like the ones that I work for, what they look like, and then like co-opting those visuals. All sort of going back to the same thing that Jocelyn is saying, like it doesn't stop people from co-opting that language and like dressing it up, and that is like there is in addition to all of the science, you still need the communications component of it too, and like sometimes the shitty people are better at that. As it turns out.
Well, I think maybe connected to this isn't something that Saini gets into, but that I think is interesting, is the idea of negative versus positive results. No one really gets excited about negative results. Like, you don't get excited about proving something doesn't happen. You get excited about proving something does happen. So like, you can publish a paper that like will get a lot of fanfare about proving like I connected these genes to brain size, but you're not going to publish a paper that says, or you're most likely not going to publish a paper, especially in a journal as well regarded as Science, that says, I searched all these genes and found none of them connected to brain size, like you're not going to get the same acclaim. Whereas like, especially like if you are like clinging to a certain message that people really want to grab onto, again, don't want to like cite the current situation, but like there are messages that people want to cling on to and that they want to like root in certain science that does not support what they're saying. But if you can phrase that in a certain way where it looks like you are an expert and you're using that kind of terminology, like it is hard for people to let go of that if that confirms how they themselves want the world to work. Propaganda, man.
Propaganda.
Something we didn't talk about, but that I think would be interesting to maybe reference, also maybe related to this, is like ancestry testing. We were sort of talking about this on the side on our own, which is basically like one of the things that Saini talks about is that companies like 23andMe, you get your results back and it tells you like you are connected to these people, like here, and here, right? And the problem is with a lot of these tests is that they're reporting that based on the data that they've already been able to collect, and that tends to be biased towards certain groups of people.
Yes, for all sorts of reasons related to just like who is interested in reporting and who is like comfortable like sharing that like their stuff with us. I have a friend who is not white, and we have talked about this quite a bit, that like, so I did 23andMe mostly because I wanted the health report, because I find this like comforting to my anxiety. The idea of being told, okay, here's all the things that's wrong. Wrong in the body. I find the map piece of it is just like was just funny to me more than anything. In a way that this is not the point I was about to make, but this actually struck me, something that like for reasons of my own foolish ignorance had not occurred to me until I was reading this book, that the very thing that I was like, this is genuinely hilarious, that like I have this map that says, okay, Nicole, you're really white. I don't know, like I'm like, okay, cool, thank you. The 23andMe map, the way that it works is literally if they can connect you to anybody in any part of the world, that part of the world will be lit up, even if it's like a half a percent. Like that's how, like, it's just like a color. You will have a color on the map. Mine is just like there's nothing outside of Europe, and then even if you like dig down into it, it's like all Northwestern Europe. And like the connotations that I have with that, like the cultural associations that I like bring to bear with that are, I don't know, like I'm a pasty white person with bad teeth. Like that to me is like LOL inbreeding is what I see when I look at that map. Personally, but I was reading the book and I was like, oh, like that. Like for a lot of people, that's the thing that they want to get, is the like super homogenous. I know somebody whose map is literally, it's just the UK. There was nothing else lit up on their map. But the thing I was about to say is that so 23andMe emails you every so often to be like, we have more data, so we're updating everybody's maps. They do this. My map has never changed because like I had sufficient data from people that were like me, that they're not like the new data that they're getting isn't changing changing things. But for my friend, we we have discussed this when they get new updates, because it is like radically moving their like the map, like the makeup, like the thing that they were originally told. I think there's just Ancestry, but like the thing that Ancestry originally told them versus like what Ancestry is telling them now is meaningfully different. So it's like, literally, what the fuck were you saying in the first place? You don't know what you were talking about. You had no idea what you were talking about. The maps that you gave me at the start were bullshit. Based on the fact that like that map, if you compare that map to this map, like there is no comparison, you know, like
it's so much about probability and statistics, which is a thing that like they're not going to tell you too. Like they're not going to be like, we modeled this and we found this %, which like, by the way, one of the other moments, like, I mean, there were a lot of moments where I was like, oh, like finding out that like one of the people who basically like built a lot of our like modern like statistics concepts was like a eugenicist. I was like, oh shit, like, like are p-values racist now? I don't know. Like, I don't know if he was involved with the p-values, but maybe. I mean, p-values are not great for probably, maybe. I don't know. Let's not argue about stats.
Join us next time.
We argue about stats. Yeah, and it's wild too, because like a lot of those companies, like, sorry, my cat is having a fit. Like 23andMe, like a lot of those places really want to gather more data from non-white people, like especially sorry, hey Ela, she can argue about stats. She knows math.
Yeah, I'm gonna bow out. I'll watch.
Yeah, so like a lot of these ancestry companies, like they want to collect data from non-white people, and like I think some people are open to that, and then others are like I haven't done any ancestry testing, and part of it is like I'm not convinced about like some of the way that they like present their data, and I like have concerns about what they're going to do with it. I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't think too hard about it. Like I don't have like a solid argument. It's just like been a thing that I don't want to do. But I feel like a lot of people, like I know other people who feel similarly, where they're like, I don't know that like what I want my data to be used for, and like it's hard. Like 10 minutes ago, I was like, we need all of the access, right? And now I'm like, but you don't get my data, right? Like,
well, yeah, I mean, and especially it's like some of this is, I am aware of the fact that like my decision to do the 23andMe thing was mostly informed by like I had a bunch of friends who were doing it, and it was like, oh, this is like, you have stuff, like, okay, I'll do the thing, and you know, whatever. But like, I have no historical or cultural context that would ever suggest to me that I should be concerned about like people exploiting my body in that way, and the way, like, and like for reasons of my own privilege, right? Like there are large communities for whom that's like a very real like threat and concern. There is like a long history of you know, of like research institutions doing really exploitative and gross and garbage stuff, and like there are, you know, she talks about this a lot throughout the book, a number of examples of this, like from indigenous populations to like Tuskegee to whatever, etc. You know, a long list of examples of like of especially non-white populations like not wanting to being like ill-used, I guess, in ways that will make them less likely to contribute to the data. And so then like you come back around to like the starting point of like the data is flawed in the first place. And so, you know, also something else that is interesting about the like the ancestry things, the other piece of this is that a lot of you are very, very likely to have any sort of like Ashkenazi Jewish, like that comes up for a lot of people. And flip side of this, it's like population who's like, wow, we've had a lot of our like heritage and ancestry like taken from us, and so like trying to reclaim it in that way, which I guess is like an I don't know, the other like piece of this, like trying to like reconnect to people in that kind of way. Other sides to it, but
it's complicated because genetics is complicated.
Yes.
Being human, it's complicated. Should we do so? Here is a call for questions or discussion things that you guys want us to talk about while we keep talking. Sorry,
yes,
I'm
we
so
didn't do
weird.
that last time, so we're trying to be more explicit about saying like hello. I mean, we've obviously been talking about the stuff that people are talking about in the chat as we go, but
You guys have a lot of really cool points.
I know. Yes, being humans is complicated. That's also going to be the running theme of Nonfiction Book Club.
Yeah. Yeah.
I suspect it will come up in the next book as well.
I think maybe I'm kind of curious what the most, like, was there something for you that was particularly surprising in this book?
I guess just to like kick everybody off, I will personally start and say that all of that stuff in the last chapter with like those like drug trials, that for me was the stuff that was far and away the most like what the fuck components of it. Like I think in this way that, and this is also very much the point of the book, but like in this way that the it's a lot easier. The historical stuff just like tracks with this sense that we have of like, you know, racist histories of institutions. I think that like that being a thing, and so the kind of seeing that kind of thing play out in such recent examples as like FDA trials, that stuff was like, oh shit.
Yeah. I think like one thing that like I hadn't really, I've never really studied or learned anything about migrations. So for me, that was like a big, like, understanding how migrations has like contributed to and like shaped genetics was like really fascinating, and especially over like millions of years. Or like, oh, like there are phases. Like she had a section where she was talking about like how like we don't know when like light skin evolved, or like when it like, or maybe we were light skinned first and then we weren't. Like that section for me was like fascinating, because it was a whole thing that I hadn't really like really ventured into.
And it's not how we talk about it. Like it is not how we talk about ancient humans too. And especially, well, going back to the DNA like 23andMe and stuff like that, that whole, it's like predicated, that is very much predicated on this idea of like who you're, I don't know, it's been so long since I've looked at it, but like one of the things that it tells you is like your like traces to like this is the one who we think walked out of Africa or like whatever, some shit like that. But it's very predicated on the idea of they like walked and they stopped here, stopped here, and then they stopped here, and then that was it. And then I don't know, then like eventually potato famine, and y'all end up in the US, and that's it. Like I
think also like related to that was like she gets into stuff that is super relevant to like my background. She gets into the caste system and Hindu nationalism, which are like both relevant to like both like where I am in my life, I guess, in terms of just like privilege and everything, but also like things that are going on right now that are very horrifying. And I think, and I had like heard people talking about like the way that Hindu nationalism is shaping the science that's being done right now, but like related to the migrations, like hearing that there are people who are like, we sprung out of like this area, like the Hindus were just born here. I was like, whoa, oh me dear, like,
oh dear.
It's like, it was like a very, like, especially after I was already like, oh wow, migration's amazing and epic and cool, and then being like, oh right, there are people who don't want to like acknowledge it because it conflicts with their views on how they stand in the world.
Yes. Jocelyn said the only thing that really shocked me was the licking dude, which should be acknowledged. You did not read the book. There's a section talking about, there's a like mural, I guess, of in a what would have been a port city during the slave trade, and it depicts a European slave trader licking a man who was about to like be put on a boat to who had been sold into slavery, and like there's like a lot of like weird speculation about why the European man was licking the African. I mean, I don't know, like this like baseline thing is that they're just like, it's a dehumanizing thing, and I'm not really sure why we need to have a full-scale investigation into that level of in that sort of idea, the racist trying to connect this to science was then like, oh, well, maybe it's about salt retention because you're going to be on a boat for a long time. And then whatever, the logical thread flowing from that was something. But also, yes, a man licks another man's face.
I forgot that part. I was like trying to remember who the licking dude was, and now I'm back in that space. Oh, that was a moment. Yeah. The thing I feel like the main thing I learned, you don't need to go to grad school for this, but the thing I learned from grad school is that like biology is complicated. Like my grad school career, I basically spent taking care of just like flasks of cells and like one type of cell, like one type of immune cell. And it was very easy to kill them. Like all you had to do was like introduce like a little bit of fungus and they would like all die. And so like I feel like the main thing I learned from that is like our bodies are both super resilient and also super fragile and also super complicated. And it's never an easy explanation. Like people, it's so tempting to like be like, yeah, these people like have salt retention capabilities because slavery, but like that is not like how biology really works. It seems like because biology is never that simple. Like bodies are so complicated. And so if your explanation is racist, it's probably wrong.
I related to that. My like big takeaway from school, that bias that I feel was confirmed by reading this book, is that like my experience was very much one of like my big takeaway from school was that I like suddenly understood that all of these things about the world that I had taken taken for granted as factual were actually like not. And like going back to the earlier we were talking about social constructs, like things being socially constructed, and like realizing how many like systems and institutions and how many things about my daily life are the way that they are because like people decided that they were going to be that way, and like there's no real reason more or less than like we just decided to do things that way, and like we can always undo that decision, and like it left me with a very cynical view of like objectivity, just period. Like it had left me like not really believing in it at all. And that was like, I think my big takeaway from this is I was like, it's a lot of scientists think that they're objective and like they're not, like, because they actually don't know shit about their own biases. Really what's happening here. And they think that they're just like objectively committed to data or whatever. I really like the studies about people who think that the more you believe that you are not affected by advertising, the more that you are affected by advertising. It's like that kind of phenomenon.
Yeah. And she like laid out a lot of really specific examples about like how our sense of data is skewed. Like there's like, I'm blanking on what all the words are, but like basically all of the ways that you center your data and how the way that like our data, especially now, is shaped so much by like European data sets and all of this stuff. Like there was the example of the Kennewick man, where they like the natives, like I forget which people, but they were like, we think he's Native American, but like when he was dug up, like people were like, he looks like he's got like Caucasian features. And and then they did the genetic test and they're like, oh, we were wrong. And it's because of like the way that our like preliminary data sets are constructed. There's so many moments like that. Like, and in some ways that's also part of why I appreciated the chapters on Hindu nationalism, because like I think like European colonialism explains a lot in the world, but it doesn't explain everything, including racism. And I appreciated those chapters both because I think they were like another case where she's including things that are relevant to like her personally, but they're also deeply relevant to the subject of the book and that show like how pervasive this kind of issue is and how we construct our science.
And the idea of just like people, per the title of the book, superior, like the idea of people trying to like prove themselves superior, like find a way to say like, yes, because of this, the objective truth of science, our people are superior, and like that myth is alluring to people the world over. that whatever the particularly gruesome legacies of European colonialism are on that, like that's not to discount that. There is something that is very attractive about that myth to all people. Is the plot twist on that. I think some of that though too, that there's like I think that here in the US, the fixation on like US racism as being exceptionally pernicious is like, well, one, I'm not convinced that it isn't, first of all, even with the other examples that she's providing, like I'm still not convinced that it isn't exceptionally pernicious. But I also think that just like it's not there's no if you are trying to change a thing, saying like, well, other people are doing the bad thing is not, not like productive or useful.
Yeah. So, I took that. And I think she, like, that's a very careful line to tread too, because you're right. Like that's the thing that people say that all the time. They're like, racism is like an American thing. Like, like, eh. No,
it's not. But I also don't want to like argue with you when you're saying that, because like I also, and this is actually, I guess, kind of the flip side of all of this. Like I have like a vested political interest in not arguing with you with somebody who says that, right? Like it's not, it doesn't actually serve like the cause of like racial justice in the United States to argue with that idea, and so like there's that like. Well,
but it's also tough because like people use that to like dismiss it and then also dismiss the racism like that happens like in their home, and it's like almost parallel to how people think. Like the flip side of it is like often people think that class isn't an issue in America, but like it's just like, no, we got all of them. Like they're all together. Like,
the problem is that we have all of them converging and
that we don't want to deal with it.
That's cool.
It's good. Great. The state of the world is very good right now.
Yeah, that is Kathy reiterating that point that like Canada pretending it isn't racist, and wow, yes, there's a lot of racism. You get the yes, like the flip side of like, oh, the like racism is an American thing, like is that it allows people elsewhere that whatever my disinterest in like disabusing Americans of that idea is like, I don't want us, like we got to focus on that, like for sure, but everybody elsewhere should probably stop saying that, because like clean your own houses.
It's like the premise of this book is just like science sucks sometimes.
Well, speaking of the book that we're doing next time,
we're ending there. We're gonna just end on me saying that science sucks. No one's gonna listen to my science things anymore. They're gonna be like, Deboki said science sucks.
Yeah, Deboki is canceled as a science communicator. Here's this clip of her saying science sucks.
The point is that science is not enough, and that we have to understand the cultural and historical factors at play. Thank you.
That's what we're trying to do here too. That's like that was our like founding, our idea.
By the end of this, I'm gonna be like, I don't want to learn about science anymore. Okay, so should we announce the next book, or do we have anything else we need to talk about with this book?
Yes, before we move on to the next book, any last science sucks sometimes. Yes, that's a really good clarification.
The comma matters.
This is easy. Yeah, that's a really good point, Jocelyn. We're easy to point to because we're the loudest about it. Yes, we're like really like aggressive. Well, we're the loudest and like the most aggressive in most of the things that we do. Just like broadly, it's like and so why not do that with our racism too? Classic US. I realized as soon as I said we should talk about the next book that I actually did not double check how to pronounce the author's name first. So I apologize in advance. Normally, if this were not a live, like if I were recording a video, I would stop and I would look it up and I would listen to somebody saying it. But I can't do that. But so the book that we are next thing that we're going to do on June 13th, second Saturday of every month is what we decided is our thing, is Dreamland, the true tale of America's opiate The True Tale of America's Opiate Epidemic by Sam Quinones, I think is how you say his last name. And yeah, so Dreamland is our next book. So again, science sucks sometimes. Is going to be a continued theme. Oh no.
It's the science. If it was science.
And also like a continued theme of like of the lines that we thought we were drawing at the start of this, of like hard science books and like social science books. Like this was very much had a ton of social science in it, and like that Dreamland appealed to me as a like sort of sociological history of, but like also it's definitely going to have, there is going to be, in order to tell that story, you have to start with like, here's the way that scientists fucked up.
It's chemistry. You might.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like organic chemistry.
I've heard of chemistry before.
That thing.
So hold on, I'm gonna copy and paste the title into the chat too, just so that it's easier to Google. So yeah, I don't have anything else to say.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I should have posted something while you were telling the title.
I don't have a copy. I'm going to pick up my copy of the book as soon as we stop recording, so I don't have it to hold up, unfortunately. That's, I'm failing at like booktuber 101, alas.
The book ready to go. I placed an order with Bookshop, and then like most of the order is still not delivering, but that one is shipping. Should have it soon. I'm excited to read it. Mm-hmm. I've been wanting to learn more about the opiate epidemic because it like goes so much into pharmaceutical industry stuff. So I think and
like comms, there's the comms piece of it too, right? Like the level of you know, that's
yeah. I like I've listened to podcasts like that, like go into some of the like advertising and like how they approach doctors and all that stuff. So yeah. Okay.
Fun.
That'll be
fun. I don't know. I use the word fun. I don't know that fun is a fair word to describe any of the three. Yeah.
I think we're gonna maybe we'll have to pick a fun book out next.
Yeah. Well,
end of the world. Something like about an animal. Except I'm sure we'll read it and then it'll be like, actually the animal is dying and is in danger.
The animal is dying. Scientists tortured it to learn the thing that we know about the animal, like whatever. So, okay, we're gonna find a fun
we're gonna find something. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, great.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
We did it.